So I'm going to kick it off. People will continue to join inevitably as time goes on, but we'll let them join late. Just to restate it, and I apologize for all the people who've been on for 5 minutes who have heard me say this 10 times already, but I'm Lee Hoffman. I'm one of the co-founders of Runwise. We started the company about 12 years ago, and we do this event every couple of weeks. The topic of the day is Local Law 97 updates. Very time sensitive, relevant issue, given that the law is actually going into effect, crazily enough, in 4 days, which is pretty insane. So again, if you have any questions or anything you were not covering, you want to see covered, jump in. If you have any insights that I'm not mentioning, we now have 75 people on here. I mean, 700 years of probably joint property management experience. If you have anything to add, please, by all means, do it. Great. All right. I'm going to move on to the topic of the day. Awesome. Let me present this. So, all right. So, as many of you know, we've been talking about Local Law 97 for years now, and we are now 4 days away from it going into effect. Last week, the city released updated guidelines for Local Law 97. So we're going to quickly do a rehash of Local Law 97, what the updates are, and then tell you really what the takeaways are. And then we're going to open it up to questions because I think that'll be more helpful than anything, honestly. So here we are. So just a reminder about Local Law 97. It applies to buildings that are over 25,000 square feet. Fines start in 2025, calculated on your 2024 usage, or flat amount based on whether it's a free market or rent stabilized. And again, there are two paths for compliance. Rent stabilized have one path, free market have a separate path. Rent stabilized buildings have two options. One, you either have to be already in compliance with your 2030 target, which is extremely rare, so I'm going to assume very few buildings are like that, or you have to follow 13 prescriptive measures. The free market, you must simply be under a threshold. So your 2024 usage, starting in when you file in 2025, you have to file your total 2024 usage, and you have to be under these thresholds right here. So I'm going to take these into the two paths. The first one is the rent stabilized. Here are the 13 measures. You can see, I'll point out that 3 of them, 1, 2, and 7, are covered by smart controls. Most of these measures are actually pretty smart, high ROI measures. Not all of them, but most. So I highly recommend, whether you have a free market or rent stabilized building, you do most of these minus 1 or 2, and I'll cover those, because they just pay for themselves and save you a lot of money. And whether you're free market or rent stabilized, these are going to help. For rent stabilized, it's required. For free market, it's going to help you get under the threshold, because a lot of these are really good for cutting down your energy usage in a cost-effective way. So what are the updates that just came out? Well, let's take the rent stabilized updates first. So they publish what the fines are. Fine per year for not complying is $20,000 per building for a rent stabilized building. $10,000 for not filing, $10,000 for not doing the prescriptive measures, so $20,000. The good news is that they removed or cut down the most ineffective, most expensive measure that was previously in the requirement. So previously, and you'll see here, it required individual TRVs, temperature controls, basically thermostatic radiator valves, or insulated radiator covers on all radiators. That is massively expensive to do. And the great news is they've removed this requirement for one pipe. So it's only required for 2-pipe buildings. This substantially reduces the cost. This was the bulk of the cost of compliance. So this is great news, will radically reduce your cost. If you do have a 2-pipe building and you want to reach out to us, Lee at Runwise, I can send you ways to comply with that in the most cost-effective way possible. But this is great news. They also published the specs for smart controls with indoor sensors. You need 25% of your units covered. So if you already have Runwise and it was paid for with a utility rebate, the good news is that you already have 25% coverage. If you have only 15% coverage. We can get you more sensors very inexpensively to cover that, and you'll immediately be in compliance for 3 of the 13 measures. I'm seeing people are raising their hands. So Jake Asher is writing, what do you mean a 2-pipe building? So steam buildings fall in a couple of different categories. The old school ones are 1 and 2 pipe buildings. It's exactly what it says. There's either a single pipe going up carrying the steam and the condensate comes back down, or it's 2 pipes, one going up and one coming back down. The measures that are required change based on whether it's a 1 or 2 pipe steam building. So the good news is if you have a 1-pipe building, you do not need to TRVs or radiator covers, which are by far the most expensive element on these prescriptive measures. What are the takeaways here? Well, the key takeaway is because they've just significantly reduced the cost of compliance and increased the ROI, meaning your return on your investment for doing the measures, it's now a pretty good ROI to get compliant. It's sort of what I said before. Most of the things that are required for these measures now are high ROI measures, meaning that they will literally save you money and pay for themselves typically in under a year. So it's just a good investment to do them anyway, and you're required if you're a rent stabilized building with local law 97. The other good news is that because the smart controls are now the dominant measure, the 3 of the 13 measures, there are rebates available right now. I don't know how long they'll last, but Con Ed and Nat Grid are paying for a good chunk of the cost of smart controls if you have gas. So I would highly recommend moving on these measures if you have not already, if you have a rent stabilized building. I recommend it for free market too, which I'll get to, but generally you really want to move on these. Not only do you need to, but they're just going to save you money. And in the middle of winter and in the fringe season, it's the best time to save money. When it's cold outside and it's freezing, you're going to run your heat endlessly. But during the fringe weather, especially what we get to in February, March, April, May, you just save a ton of money with smart controls and some of these other measures. For market rate, there are no major changes here. They did publish the good faith efforts clause. It's kind of hard to comply with these good faith measures. So I'll just basically say, if you have a market rate building and you haven't essentially followed the prescriptive measures, if you haven't got a smart control in, you haven't done insulation, you haven't done venting, you haven't done LEDs, I would do them ASAP. The clock for how much energy you use starts January 1st. So most of the companies like ours that are doing these measures are already backed up a couple of months because of demand. So if you haven't done these things, I highly recommend you do it like ASAP. Your total what you're going to be fined on in 2025 is based on your 2024 usage. So if you're over the threshold, you really need to put these measures in ASAP. If you aren't over the threshold, my recommendation is to do these measures anyway, A, because they'll save you money and pay for themselves in a handful of months, and B, because if you do all the low cost, high ROI measures up front, you know where you stand for 2020, 2030, and then you know what higher cost measures, if any, you have to do. Most buildings can get through 2030 simply by doing these 4 measures and also maybe one major upgrade, downsizing boilers to higher efficiency boilers, replacing windows, something like that. So I highly recommend doing these measures ASAP. You'll save a lot of money, but also it'll tell you where you need to be, and you'll have time to budget for the 2020-30 goals. Also, and I said this before, utility rebates have been available for 5 to 10 years. Because local law 97 is going to affect, the rebates are going down. So last year, the rebates went down about 30%. I expect that to continue. So if you haven't claimed the rebates for smart controls, I highly recommend you get that free money while it's available. We can help you with that. We do all of the work. Sorry. Anna's asking, what is ROI? Return on investment. It means if you put in $1, how much money are you going to get back? Right? And the goal with most of these measures is that if you put in $100, you're going to make that $100 back in a handful of months. And then if it costs you $5 a year, you should be making $30 or $40 a year back in savings. Dane Barkin wrote, return line leaks. It's also worth checking with your supers if they may be consuming any water from the hose connection that's on the same water line that feeds the boiler. Sometimes just alerts me when our supers have been hosing down their compactor rooms. Great point. Daniel, you have a question?
Yes. My question is, do basements count towards the 25,000 square feet, which require compliance with the local law?
I believe they do. Marco, do you know the answer?
Yes, they do.
And it applies even to commercial retail buildings. It's not just
all the usage space the owner's responsible for. So the city will allocate certain property use types and the square footage of each. So for example, 40,000 square foot building, 35,000 is multifamily use and 5,000 is office space or restaurant use. The city has an algorithm for how much metric tons of carbon those use types and the size of them should be using.
Okay, thanks.
And I just want to introduce Marco. Marco is from Carlton Energy Consulting. They do a lot of they are the largest benchmarker and compliance company in the city. So if you don't use them for your benchmarking, I highly recommend it. If you don't use them for your local law 87 audits, I highly recommend them. And also, if you just have questions about local law 97, we're obviously happy to answer them.
So we have a large grocery store, which is in a food desert, and we believe it's the main source of our D grade. We have no control. We're just actually getting ready to do a contract with new lease renewal with them. We have no control over that, but we'd like to get some provisions in there for something regarding their refrigeration, which is clearly the source of the thing. But don't they have any allowance for this sort of needed thing?
Great question. So, like Lee was saying, we benchmark over 4,000 buildings just in New York City, and this is a common issue that the city really hasn't given full clarification on going forward. A lot of our clients are some of the largest landlords and buildings in the city that have extremely large commercial spaces. From the city's perspective, and we always say this, don't shoot the messenger. From the city's perspective, they basically have an algorithm for how large the use type is and how much energy they should be protruding out going forward. So there are different limits going forward. There's a 2024 through 2029 annual limit. There's a new limit that kicks in 2030 and beyond that is extremely stringent. Basically what our clients are doing, and I would advise you to talk to whoever your attorney is or whoever's doing your lease agreements. Most of our clients, especially the savvy ones, have been putting this into their leases going forward, that these commercial spaces are going to be responsible for whatever upgrades or improvements or whatever fines that will be associated with the building according to whatever their square footage is that they're leasing. So I'm not an attorney, so I don't want to tell you exactly what you should say. Your attorney should know, but I would advise putting something not vague, but something that, because these laws continuously change. The city's changed them 4 or 5 times already, and we're assuming they're going to change them more and more going forward.
But a supermarket uses so much more energy than like a clothing store.
Exactly.
And it's a necessity. It's not like an optional thing for a neighborhood to have. So I'm kind of perplexed by this.
So the city says, like for instance, if you have let's just say hypothetically you have a 30,000 square foot building and 20,000 is multifamily space, and then you have 10,000 of commercial space. If you have a certain square footage of a restaurant, the city says that use type should be using X amount of metric tons of carbon. If you have an office, it should be using a different amount of metric tons of carbon based off of, like you're saying, they allocated. So obviously a manufacturing plant or an industrial plant has a much larger carbon emissions limit than, let's say, a clothing store like you're referencing or an office. They're claiming
10,000 square foot grocery store. So that's my issue.
I agree. Every square footage and every use type is allocated for a certain amount of carbon. And the city, and like we said, we don't speak for them, but they're saying that you're fair if the building or if the use type is basically being upkeeped properly, if they have, the most energy efficient, not most, but at least upgraded within the last couple of years, refrigerated units or Energy Star certified appliances or whatever's going on in that use type, that's what they're allocating you should be using.
And that number is written into the local law 97 law.
Yeah, in the actual law, every use type, there's a certain amount of metric tons of carbon, let's just say 0.000 X, whatever the number is, for every single different type of use type. I mean, there are general use types that certain ones kind of fit in between, but more often the city has kind of unveiled and
Great.
made it more detailed. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
So Greta Pryor says we have 3 buildings, 2 are connected and have a D energy grade. We have a Bright Power report saying that the building is 79 gallons of water per unit versus 8 gallons of the other buildings, which has an A grade. 79 gallons per unit seems really high. Yeah, Greta, this is a great example, of where you really want to keep track of water where possible. You didn't say what the use case of the buildings is. I'm going to assume they're residential. But if you have a large amount of water being used in one of the buildings, first off, we offer, if you have Runwise, we offer a free service where we will ingest your DEP bills and we'll analyze them for free and tell you if we think there's a leak. So that might be a good starting place. It costs nothing. We're happy to do it. And we'll give you an estimate. Yeah, we do think there's a leak in that one building. And then if there is, you can either do manual inspections or you can use something like our Riser product to find exactly where the leak is and try to solve it. Greta, you have your hand raised. Do you want to say something?
Sure. So thanks. So we just signed up for Runwise, so hopefully we'll be kicking that off in January. But our other question is, you were talking about the system would detect if a window was open or something like that. So our sensors will be installed, I guess, first quarter 2024. We have a number of owners who have furniture all up against their radiators. So technically heat is getting to the unit, but it's being absorbed by the furniture. So would the sensor detect, like, well, the unit's cold, but it's kind of an extenuating circumstance?
It's very hard to detect furniture blocking. There are a couple recommendations for this type of situation. First off, there's a reason why we have a lot of sensors. We do 15 to 25% coverage, so one individual sensor is not going to drive the building. Second is, and I mentioned this before, and we posted a link to the YouTube above, but if you watch the videos, I have a what to do in unit to save energy, and like that's a clear example where it's hard because it is the tenant's up to the tenant. But if you can make a case to the tenant and say, hey, look, let me show you the temperatures in the building. Your unit is this much colder. We can't run the heat more because of energy laws in the city. So if you want your apartment to be warmer, we need to move your couch 2 feet out or 3 feet out, right? You can give them an incentive and you have actual data to prove it by saying, look, your apartment is so much colder and it's because this couch is blocking the heating. That is a common issue. We see it all the time. Definitely, if you can remove obstructions, whether it's furniture, some people put like covers over the radiator. I've seen crazy stuff, but generally, if you can go through units and you follow our checklist, which I referenced in the video, you can generally save about 10% of your energy usage just by addressing the in-unit issues like that.
Great, thank you.
John wrote, what's the easiest way to track your building emissions carbon footprints? Do websites compile this info? Be useful to see how close your property is to see the requirements. And Marco wrote that at CEC, they'll do benchmarking and LL97 analysis as well. We are launching a product in a few months that will also just show you how your energy is doing generally. But yeah, CEC is a great reference point for that. And we'll happily give you a reference. If you're a Runwise customer, you can also email our support at Runwise or call us 24/7. I didn't cover this in the demo. I usually do, but I will show you. Let me shift back over. You can contact support anytime right here. You can call us, text us, email us 24/7, 365 at 3 in the morning, 2 in the morning. Somebody will pick up, somebody will answer. And if you want to know where your buildings are on the local law 97 guidelines, we're happy to help you with that as well. Other questions? Jake wrote, how do you find out the square footage of your building? Is it something that can be looked up? Yes, you can look it up on the DOB's website. You type in the block and lot. Any other questions? Anybody, anything else people want to cover just generally about heating, local law 97, water?
Lee, I just wanted to say quickly, because I saw a couple of people had that question and they referred to the letter grade.
Yeah.
I think it's important, and I know Runwise often tells their clients, I think it's important to remind everybody that the city does, the the city does nobody any favors making these things clear, but the letter grades that you guys receive each year from your annual benchmarking is actually not synonymous with your local law 97 fines in any way, shape, or form. So just to give you an example, I told you guys how many buildings we handle annually each year. We have hundreds of buildings that actually have D grades that are not on pace for fines, and we have buildings that have A's and B's that are on pace for fines. So I know that sounds like it makes no sense because it doesn't, but the short answer is the reason that there's a different correlation between them is your letter grades are actually graded off of a curve of your building's energy usage compared to other similar like buildings across the city. Whereas Local Law 97 is just a strict carbon cap of your building, its size, and its use type. So the reason why this gets thrown off is you have buildings that are either undergoing construction, buildings that have estimated meter readings, or maybe buildings that are being benchmarked wrong, that buildings are unfairly compared to. So it's just kind of importantly, your client should know that if they have a D, they're not totally screwed. And if they have an A, that doesn't necessarily mean that they should, feel that they're in the clear.
Fantastic point, Marco. Yeah, I mean, it's the city's not made life easy and making this understandable and easy. But that's hopefully why we have great people like Marco to help. Jason wrote, if the building is mixed between market rate and rent stabilized unit, what pathway should we take? Apologies if this was already answered. There's a cutoff for market rate versus stabilized. Marco, do you know that cutoff?
Yes, you are applicable for the prescriptive pathway if you're over 35% rent stabilized, so it's 36% units and above, if you're an HDFC co-op, or if your building has a federal regulatory agreement. So Section 8 housing, Section 202, and the last one is a worship facility. So if you have partially rent stabilized buildings, so if you're between 1% and 35% and not over that threshold, then your buildings have the exact same compliance pathway each year as free markets, but your fines do not kick in until 2026. So instead of your 2024 emissions being dinged with violations or that threshold, it's not until 2026 for the partially stabilized buildings.
Great. Thank you, Marco.
You got
Brian,
it.
you have a question.
Yeah, you mentioned square footage. And when you look up the square footage, it typically says estimate, and it's giving the whole facility.
Mhm.
So part of the facility is commercial, let's say. Those square footages need to be broken out, one thing. And the other is that if those are estimates, I guess my question is, does the local law 97 compliance require verifying the square footage? So I did a report for building, and when I measured everything, I had more square footage, and so less carbon per square foot.
Good question, Brian. Lee, you mind if I
Yeah, go for it, please.
Yeah. So basically what the city uses every single year for the annual benchmarking is what the Department of Finance has listed as the total square footage of the building. So that's total roof space, basement space, even if it's not, rentable space. It's still whatever the overall building's energy usage is being protruded out. That's what you have to file. When you're submitting the local 197, in the past, you didn't have to be licensed or certified or anything. That's why the city gets a lot of crappy data. And that's why one of the reasons that the letter grades are thrown off. For local 197, you have to be a licensed retro commissioning agent or a licensed PE that's submitting this data. And if your Department of Finance, if your submission does not match what the city has designated for you by the Department of Finance, they're going to ask for backup proof. So yes, it is very common. As we know, the city makes mistakes often. If, for instance, like you had an architect or an engineer, a registered design professional that did a survey of the property, and your building is actually larger than whatever the Department of Finance has it designated for, that would have to be included in whatever submission eventually for Local Law 97, where whoever the licensed third party would be, whether it's us or somebody else, they would have to put what the building's 2024 emissions are, what the building's total square footage is, and then the breakdown of those square footage. So they call it property use details. So if you have a 100,000 square foot building, like you said, and you have a certain square footage of commercial space, how much is that square footage and what is that commercial space? And all of those use types have to equal the totality of the building. And I
Okay.
would, and yeah,
A CEM is certified to do this.
a CEM should be, yes. They're on that list in the new proposed rules.
Okay.
We have a question from Bill. Bill, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I have two buildings, two separate block and lots
Mhm.
that have one heating plant.
Mhm.
So my building 8-10 is roughly 50,000 square feet, 53 units. My building 2, which is heated by the same plant, has 18 units and roughly 20,000 square feet.
Mhm.
I feel like, my building 8-10, I have to comply with local law 97, but it's actually heating 71 units, not the 58.
Good
So
question.
I feel it's thrown off and I'm being penalized for it. Is that the case?
So you make sure, if it's us that's doing your benchmarking, make sure that the certified energy managers are aware of that fact. So how it works is the city has a covered buildings list of all the buildings that have to comply with each energy local law or local laws in general. If one of those buildings is on the BBL, officially, if you have multiple buildings that have different BBLs, if one of the BBLs are on the covered list and they share a heating system, they would be filed together and what's called a campus filing. So that square footage would be included, even though that additional BBL is under the square footage threshold, it's included. And let's say instead of your filing saying this address is 50,000 square feet, it would have both addresses with the combined totality of it. There's also the instance that there's the potentiality that neither of the buildings are on the covered list, even if they're over the square footage threshold, because sometimes the city will leave those buildings off. It's best to just confirm with your service provider if the buildings are on the covered list, but you don't have to worry that you're being unfairly, or I don't want to say that because the city does do that to buildings, but they do take that into account. Short answer.
Taking one step further, my smaller building has a restaurant.
Mhm.
So if I have to include the energy usage of that restaurant, is it possible that my fine would be bigger?
So
I include it?
if you're being reported correctly, you would be allocating for that. So instead of the, let's just say 8-10, which is at 50,000 square feet with X amount of units, the submission or the filing would include both addresses, the totality, so 70 plus thousand square feet, but then also the breakdown. This 70,000 square foot BBL that has multiple BBLs also has a 2,500 square foot restaurant, and that would raise that building's emissions limit. And the emissions limit would be applied to how large the building is and then what the individual use types are.
Okay, thank you.
You got it.
Question from Daniel.
Where can I find, some of the buildings we have, they're close to the 25,000, but like Marco said, it depends what Department of Finance has it registered as. So where can I find, the square footage they have it recorded as to see, if according to their records, we have to comply.
You can do a couple of things. What we usually do is we'll look on Property Shark first just to see the generic square footage that they have it listed. That's not official, but we can use it. You don't need a Property Shark account to just look up what they have listed as the square footage. And then once we have the borough block and lot number, the BBL, we check. You can Google, and if you want, you can also email it to me and just email me the addresses. But you can Google the local law 84-133 benchmarking covered list, which comes out every year. And there's also a local law 97 covered list that was released, and it's based off of, it's in order of BBL number. So we check. So if you have a building that's listed on Property Shark at 24,000 square feet or 23,000, and then you look up the BBL on the covered list, sometimes more often than not, it'll be on that list. Then there are times where you might think the building is 27,000 square feet and Property Shark has it listed as that. And then you check the covered buildings list and it's not listed there, meaning that whatever the Department of Finance has it as, it's under that threshold and you don't have to comply.
I gotcha. And so, but meaning if on my property tax bill, I think usually if it's a building that they have it down as that size, then usually it'll be on there. That
Yes, exactly. And that's what the city says that they use, the Department of Finance. But like I said before, they have been known to make mistakes. And then to go back to the gentleman before's point, this is kind of off the record, but we do have clients who basically said like, oh, you know, you guys have me listed at 78,000 square feet. I'm actually 85,000 square feet. I'm being unfairly, you know, penalized. I'm missing 7,000 square foot of emissions limits. And then once we run their analysis, they're actually, you know, 35% in the green or 40% in the green. And we tell them, hey, you can pay a registered design professional to submit something to the city to get it raised, but you're already in the green and you're not going to get fined. So if you want, I'm sure they're going to raise your property taxes after you tell them that your building is larger. So, you know, that's kind of our tact of, you know, our most important thing is to first see if you're applicable for the energy local law, local law 97. Once you know that you are, see where your actual emissions are and where the city has you designated of what you're supposed to submit. And then if God forbid, which we do have clients like this as well, they were on pace for violations and the DOF had them listed as much larger structure than they had allocated for. We edited it, we updated it, and then they were in the green. So, you know, it could work both ways.
Thanks.
Thank you, Marco. Larry, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Marco, could you just clarify the qualifications for the 13 measures and rent stabilize? The thing that I'm unclear about is what you're talking about. I mean, I understand over 35%, but what's the other requirements regarding Section 8, et cetera? I mean, does the building, if they have one Section 8 tenant?
So that's a good question. So the city, and I can email you if you want to shoot me your email in the chat. I'll email you the FAQ from the city. They have a Q&A too of frequently asked questions. So they say if a building has just one unit that participates in a federal project-based housing program, so you can technically just have one Section 8 unit and be applicable for the prescriptive pathway, but it's not just a Section 8 voucher. Like you can't just throw in a unit there and start accepting a Section 8 voucher from a sponsored tenant or something like that. It has to have the city clarified it, that the building has to be in some sort of a federal project-based assistance program with a Section 8 or Section 202 or Section 811. That's how they kind of clarify it.
Okay, great. That really helps. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
So I just put a link in the chat to Zola, which is the city's zoning and land use map. You can look up your building and see what the city thinks the square footage is. There you go.
Just to do a little presentation, we'll show our office right here. There you go. It doesn't show a picture of me and Kellyanne in there, but you know, everything else it shows. Cool. Thank you, Brian. That's really helpful. Super 7031 wrote, if we set the building temperature at 75, can the resident adjust the temperature in their apartment, low or high? No. So when I was showing before what the temperature is here, and I'll share this again over here, this is controlled by your building and staff. And the reason is that you'll always have a tenant who likes their apartment at 95 degrees, right? And you can't give them control, right? The job of your team is to filter what's coming in and decide, is this actually a legitimate complaint or not? The beauty of having sensors in the apartment is you can actually look at the temperature instead of somebody calling in and saying it's freezing in my apartment and just immediately boosting the entire building. You can look at their apartment and say, well, actually, it looks like it's 75 degrees in your apartment. You know, like maybe you have the window open, maybe, you know, like you need to put on on heavier clothes, and you can be responsive. And it's only if your staff says, you know what, it legitimately feels cold, we recommend usually visiting, that you then would submit a boost of heat or something like that to change the temperature. But you do that as the owner or manager, not the tenant. Larry, go ahead.
Sorry, one more quick one.
Go for it.
I've asked plumbers this issue. I mean, this question before. I'm just curious what you guys think. You know, we're talking about there's always going to be some units who are colder than others. It's just human nature, whether they're in the cold part of the building or not. Some people are cold. Is it possible to go in and make the building warmer by installing, for example, a larger radiator? Or is there anything like that that could be done? I mean, it may be costly, but maybe a building might want to do that for those complainers.
It's a fantastic question, Larry. So what you're basically describing, and we talked about it before, but just to repeat for everybody, is you have a central heating unit in the building, central heating system, boiler, and you have apartments, random apartments that are hotter or colder. What can you do to make the coldest apartments warmer so that you can run the heating less on average, right? And the first answer is, before you do anything expensive, you definitely want to know what the temperatures are, right? So having sensors in. If you already have those, what I highly recommend, and I talked about this, I have a video that's entitled save 10% on your energy with 10 minutes of work in each apartment once a year. Watch that video. In most cases, it's not all. There are times where the radiator is just undersized, or there's some issue with the envelope at a specific part of the building. But by and large, when there are random apartments that are cold and it's not on a specific line, it usually is an in-unit issue, and it can be as simple as the radiator being turned off, the air vent on the radiator not working or being painted over, the radiator valve being closed or broken, windows. I tell the story all the time, but when I first met my wife, I told her that something like 10 to 15% of people who complain about their apartment being too cold have the window open and don't know it. And my wife is like an Ivy League graduate lawyer, and she, immediate response is, how could anybody be so dumb to not know their window is open? And 2 weeks later, we were in her apartment sitting on the couch, and she says to me, I think the heating system in the building is broken in my bedroom. And I said, that doesn't really make logical sense. I don't think that's the case. She's like, I know, but it's always colder in my bedroom. I think something's broken. So I went into the bedroom and I look up at the top of the window, and sure enough, there's an 1/8 of an inch that's open, and I go click, right? So I just see this so often, that obstructions, there's a whole list. Watch the video. I highly recommend going through every apartment once a year and just doing it, following the checklist, making 100% sure. Window ACs, another one that's on that checklist. Like, owners and managers tell me all the time, it's not my responsibility. The reality is, the window ACs are losing a vast amount of heat, and you're probably paying $10,000 or $20,000 more on your heating bill because they're in there. So highly recommend you either remove them for your tenants and put them back in at the end of the year, or you buy a high R value AC cover. Marco's company CEC makes one. There are other ones, but these are things that are like no brain dead, no cost, and in most cases will address the issue. If there's something more systemic, like a whole line is cold, then I start looking at like venting issues. Is there air being trapped in the line preventing heat? Those are the types of things. But if it's random apartments, it's usually an in-unit issue.
So I understand what you're saying 100%. And we look at all of those issues.
Things, yeah.
My point here is just, there's a person who's cold. There's a reason they're cold, and they're not going to get warmer by sealing their windows or doing any of that kind of stuff. Would putting in a larger radiator help the issue, or no?
It probably would. I don't see it happen that often because of cost. But there is probably a calculation to be done on the cost versus the amount of energy you can save by not raising the cumulative heat output for the building. Marco might be able to help with that, but it probably will help. Marco, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
No, I think you cut. That was perfect. I think it probably would.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
No problem. Any other questions before we wrap things up?
She's asking about pricing for all of this, and if it corresponds to building size, or if we have a flat rate pricing model or whatnot.
Do you want to take it, Kellyanne?
Sure. So, the pricing does have to do individually with each of your buildings. So you can reach out. I can drop my email in here as well to me or Lee. Typically, the larger, your building is, the more expensive the runway system will be. But, we really strive to make sure at the end of the day, you get more money than you pay for us back in the savings for the building. So we're never going to take an exorbitant amount of that or anything like that. But as you know, a 30-unit building versus a 200-unit building, pricing is going to be very different. And so if you're interested in us taking a look at cost for you, you can certainly reach out to us, and we can get your address and, do a walkthrough and give you a quote that's bespoke to your building.
And Anna, it's here, I'm going to put my email in. And just so you know, like it is more expensive for runwise in bigger buildings because there's a lot more sensors and repeaters that have to go in. But the bigger the building, typically the faster it pays for itself and the better you save because you save more money. So a very large building you might pay X dollars for the install and completely pay that back in like 3 or 4 months. And if it's on gas, Con Ed or Nat Grid may pay for a chunk of it. So generally, most times Runwise will pay for itself in under a year and many times under 6 months. No, you don't. Do we have to file a DOB? No, you don't have no filing required for Runwise. It's just straight up smart control. We're in and out of the building usually in a day or two if it's a large building, or a half a day or 1 day if it's a small building. It's very fast. Everything is wireless, so it's a very fast, non-invasive install, and typically starts saving you literally the next day. 148. Yep, Anna. We do 100. We do very large buildings. We do 500 unit buildings, all the way down to small buildings. You're a very wide building. We have several of those. All that's required for smart controls is that you have a central heating system. Like if you have, for example, a boiler in every single apartment, that's not really a great fit. But if it's 6 units or above and a central heating system, you're almost certainly going to save a lot of money putting smart controls in like Runwise. Anna, if you want, I'm happy to walk you through it and walk through your building more precisely. If you want to send me an email, I'm happy to look at your building in specific. I think that's it. Any last questions before we wrap up?
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. I will
Thanks,
send out an
Lee.
email
Thank you.
in the
Nice
next few days
presentation.
with the recording and links and stuff. But if you have any questions, you can always reach me at lee@runwise.com. Thank you very much and really appreciate you all attending. Talk to you
Thanks,
soon.
Lee.
Thank
Happy New Year,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Happy New
Thanks,
Year.
Mark.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.